Before you proceed, Mr. Pretorius, Minister Gordhan, the extracts which you read from your own budget speech, as well as the then Secretary General's speech about more or less 10 years ago, were they both around 2009?
The budget extracts from 2009.
Yes.
The Secretary General's points go back from December 2017 to I think mid-year 2017, and some are further back. But they're much more recent.
Okay, all right. But I seem to remember that even before the time of President Zuma, his predecessor, President Begi, had in his speech also been talking quite strongly on issues of corruption. Is that your recollection as well, or not really?
That might well be the case, but we can check that,
Yes.
Chairperson.
Now, I consider myself reasonably informed in terms of what is in the public domain, but I struggle to remember any instances I may have heard of or read of in the media over a very long time of the ruling party taking disciplinary action against its own members in regard to issues of corruption. Is your recollection different?
There might be...
That is, maybe I must qualify that without waiting for state institutions, in other words, without waiting for criminal prosecution, just taking disciplinary action in those matters where there may be allegations of corruption.
The first qualifier, Chair, that I wish to put forward in response to your point is I'm not representing the ANC. And that
I accept that.
So when officials of the ANC appear before you, they must answer that. But to assist you, I think the narrative has emerged in different forms. So probably earlier in the 2000s, there was a debate about whether a member should recuse himself or herself from active ANC programs if the person is merely charged, or must that person first go through a trial, then a court decides, and thereafter the person then has to do the necessary. But usually it would appear from the one or two instances that I seem to remember that applies to the constitutional provisions about whether you can be a member of parliament or not, because if you have a criminal record, as you know, you can't. So I think what the Secretary General is saying, and other documentation also, is that we need to do better and do more in that regard, not just as the ANC, but as the constitutional structures of the state as well.
Now, maybe I must just mention, for what it's worth, why I'm asking this question, and I'm sure that you understand, yeah, and a lot of people would understand. The ANC was given power by the electorate, and the electorate would expect it to govern in accordance with certain values and principles. And one can imagine that people in the electorate or sections of the electorate would keep an eye and watch what's happening, and they may be saying, to the extent that there has been or may have been state capture, what did the ANC do once it realized there were certain practices and so on and so on. And it may well be that, probably will be, that the Commission must look at everything to see what may have constituted a fertile ground for state capture to happen, or to happen the way it may have happened, and what is it that an important player such as the ruling party should have done or did or didn't do, which may have assisted to get state capture to be where it is. And as I always mention, I proceed on the basis that my terms of reference says allegations of state capture, and I've got to look at the matter in that way until the findings are made. So that's the context in which I was asking that question.
No, it would be fair to say that, Chairperson, as you say, that firstly, and if I may say so, I would rather call the ANC a governing party. There are many in South Africa who would like to be rulers. So we don't want to be a ruling party. But as a governing party, and the statements that I've read out indicate that already, our first accountability is to the South African public. It is to ensure, in terms of our core mission articulated in the constitution of the ANC, that we serve the South African people, all of them. But secondly, we've got to correct the historical wrongs that the majority of our people have been subjected to over time. And thirdly, as the Constitution eventually says as well, we've got to both transform this country and arrive at a situation where we say that we are advancing social justice every single day, if that is actually possible. Have we fallen short of that mission? Probably, but I think it would be wrong to leave an impression that the ANC equals everybody, because like any other voluntary organization, there would be differences in terms of how one interprets principles and values, but more importantly, how one practices those, puts into practice the principles and values as well. But secondly, as we'll come to later in the statement, there is the phenomenon of the fight back. There is the phenomenon which says that those who have engaged, let alone engaging in, but those who have engaged in malfeasance, as I said earlier, engage in the politics of distraction. So find as many distractions as possible, using modern technology, which has become quite a feature after Bell Pottinger, and do whatever you can so that the spotlight doesn't fall on you. The spotlight must constantly be moved to others for one or other reason. And as you know, Chair, and you might want to get an expert on this, throughout the world, including our own situation, fake news is a reality. So academics are talking about fake news, post-factual news, and so on and so on. I'm sure there's some experts sitting here that can help us in that particular regard. But all of that is to ensure that elites or small groups of people become beneficiaries of extractive processes and enjoy their status as elites, whilst the people that they nominally indicate that they are serving fall by the wayside. And that is, in fact, one of the big causes of, A, the inequality we see across the world and in South Africa, and secondly, the disenchantment with elites, be they political, business, and other elites in societies. And thirdly, there's a lot of literature available which would indicate how populism becomes a fact in many societies, largely right-wing populism, and sometimes disguised in left-wing rhetoric. And that, again, serves the purpose of particular groups, and that then gives rise to particular political outcomes as well. So people will defend their largesse or access to their largesse in some way or the other. And you'll see a lot of it. In my short experience in the public enterprises portfolio, as soon as one identifies a senior executive who has quite evidently participated in over a number of years in one or other kind of malfeasance, and their transactions after transactions to actually prove it, and forensic evidence to prove it, the pattern that's emerging is one where, if you like, clients would have been developed over the years, and these are what you might call sub-capture processes. So there's big capture, if I may suggest that, but there's also small capture, where as a CEO or as a CFO or as a senior manager, you develop your own client base. You supply them with money, so when you get into trouble, they're there to defend you in one form or another. And we've seen that in real life as well. And that then becomes part of the phenomenon that I described earlier on. You then get this masking effect, but also the fight back or counterattacks in one form or another as well. So coming back to the core of your point, there will be those of us who fervently still believe that the core principles of the ANC Constitution and our own Constitution as the country are the key principles that must drive our conduct. We're human, so we're fallible. Doesn't mean we don't make mistakes, but as best as we can, we try to achieve those objectives in the day-to-day practices we actually engage in. And one hopes that the kind of reflection that the new president of the ANC is trying to induce within the ANC itself as part of the renewal project will begin to set the governing party on the right course. And there's some evidence that we're moving in that direction.
No, thank you very much. I'm sure we might revisit later on, but I'm happy that you proceed subject to what Mr. Pretorius has.
Thank you, Chair. Well, perhaps, Minister Gordhan, a good place to start now is paragraph 14 of your evidence, where you state that your own knowledge and understanding of state capture, like that of the rest of the country, evolved over time. It's a partial answer to the questions being raised by the Chair. The first point I'd like to emphasize in paragraph 14 is you talk of state capture rather than corruption. And you will later give evidence about how you understand the distinction between those two concepts. But if you'd like to deal, please, with the issues in paragraph 14, and allow me, if I may, to ask you one or two questions about what you say in paragraph 14.
Sure. With reference to both 13 and 14, Chair, if I may, the one important qualifier that one must, and I must put before you, is that this is just one contribution, if you like, to contributing or providing a piece of a jigsaw puzzle. So the jigsaw puzzle will eventually give you the state capture as we know it. I'm not claiming that I have full knowledge of everything, but within my experience and the experience of colleagues that I have worked with, here's a piece of that puzzle. And one hopes that the Commission itself, having collected the pieces in various ways, will be able to pull it together. The second point, as Mr. Pretorius points out, is that state capture, I suppose one of the distinctions that one could draw between corruption as a fragmented ad hoc activity, so to speak, unconnected to what in law you probably will call racketeering or an organized crime. And the organized crime here is a systematic takeover of key institutions in order either to loot or to protect the looting process in some way. And by protection of the looting process, it means also acting against those who want to fight against the looting process, be they in a governing party, other political parties, civil society formations, and even in the courts for that matter as well. So if one chooses the latter as the paradigm within which to actually work, then I thought it is useful to ask the Commission to look into the Betrayal of the Promise report done by, or prepared by a number of academics, which provides, as I indicate in paragraph 16, a useful conceptual framework. And what I would suggest is that this is a hypothesis you work with. When the pieces of the puzzle are available, you can work out whether the hypothesis has relevance or not. But the framework certainly provides one and yourselves with an opportunity, and indeed the public, as to what is this picture called state capture? What are the key components of it? Who or what could be the key actors within it? What roles do they actually perform? And how do those roles all contribute to the process of extracting funds and locating them in whatever place they simply get located?
Minister, you've asked for a certain document to be included in the bundle,
Yes.
which we've included in the supplementary bundle. But before we go there, may I take you back to paragraph 14 of your statement? In that paragraph, you say that your knowledge and understanding of state capture evolved over time. And you say, in relation to state capture, I emphasize, as opposed to corruption, the interrelationship of such events were revealed progressively and often only in hindsight. May I just ask, the question has been raised indirectly, I think, by the chair, perhaps even directly, that the evidence of state capture must have been known or ought to have been known to the executive and, as you refer to it, the governing party, and the response thereto was somewhat delayed. What do you say to that?
Well, if you go back to your first point, which is that I'm trying to look for an analogy, but again, let's use the jigsaw puzzle as an analogy. Once you empty the box with the 100 or 500 or 1,000 pieces, they don't all suddenly appear as a picture in front of you. They are merely pieces. So the picture actually evolves as the pieces begin to fit in the right place. You put it in the wrong place, of course, you'll get the wrong picture, or it won't fit at all. I'm sure all of us have had experience with jigsaw puzzles at one stage or another. And so the point I'm making here is that what might have been seen as fragmented, ad hoc, corrupt activities did not give rise to the notion of state capture, certainly in our understanding at a particular point in time. Again, I draw reference to the comments made in the 2009. You've made reference, Chair, to President Mbeki's remarks possibly prior to that as well. And all that suggests is that you have a build-up of evidence which says there's something a lot more sinister than just individual acts of corruption that is actually going on. And that then gives rise to the notion that once enough dots appear and the dots themselves are clear enough, then one might have the ability or the opportunity to connect those dots and then see the beginnings of a picture. And as we go through this process and go through each forensic report that we are now either conducting or looking at, having been conducted earlier on, more dots are appearing. And they appear at different levels of detail, if you like. And connecting those dots then gives us the opportunity, particularly after the release of the Gupta emails, which the Commission has access to, I believe, a more complete picture of who was involved, what role were they involved in, and in a moment when we refer to that particular annexure, there's a suggestion from the authors of the Betrayal of the Promise report about how one could look at this particular picture. So the notion, the second point was about delayed action. If a matter is evolving over time and evolving in the fragmented way I'm suggesting, then one must ask whether specific acts of corruption were dealt with or not dealt with, and I'm sure if one goes into a detailed study, there would be some evidence to suggest that there was action taken, or there were steps taken from the Treasury and from other entities as well to stop those acts of corruption, to ensure that the regulatory frameworks created around procurement and constantly improved were beginning to have some kind of impact and would act either as a limitation to what people wanted to do. So we'll give you later on the case of Denel Asia, where provisions of Section 54 and Section 51 of the PFMA required certain things to be done and certain approvals to be obtained before any state entity can just go ahead and create another entity. And that's the check and balance within government that allowed some preemptive steps to be taken to stop different forms of corruption. At other stages, I'm sure, and I haven't, I must say, undertaken any study in this regard, although I see in the audience Mr. Brown, who's the former head of the Procurement Office in the Treasury, who might one day come to you and give you some interesting evidence as well in terms of his experience. So was there resistance to the fragmented instances of corruption? I bet there are instances in that regard, some of them preemptive, some of them post facto. Was there resistance in relation to state capture as it began to be evident in a more holistic way? Definitely. Otherwise, we wouldn't have seen some of the activities around Mr. Nene's dismissal and the events that have followed since then, and the various changes that now post facto or in retrospect we can see in boards of SOEs, management of SOEs as well, and the extraordinary efforts that different parties undertook to become part of this process. So one of the documents that the Commission might want to look at is this one. It's a ESCOM inquiry reference book that we used in Parliament, which is very clearly illustrative, both of the timelines, in other words, changes at the level of the executive, changes in management, and the various procurement projects that were undertaken at different stages from 2010 onwards. And it's a classic case that's well researched, which is illustrative of the state capture narrative. So I want to suggest that there are many people inside and outside of government who began to understand state capture for what it was, B, did offer resistance, C, themselves then became victims of harassment and attacks of all sorts, and D, continued to be the subjects of such attacks as well. That means those who are attacking us have something to hide, something to protect, something to distract the public with. The question is what? But I suppose that will come at some stage or the other. And the setting up of the Commission and the work of the Public Protector must be applauded, because that then gives rise to where we are today and the opportunity to canvass all of these issues in a much more exhaustive way.
Perhaps, Minister, we can deal with questions of timing of all the approaches and the extent of knowledge to which you've referred when we deal with matters in more detail later. But you've made the distinction between acts of corruption, however widespread those acts might be on the one hand, and an organized project or the state capture project, as you might have referred to it, on the other. And you deal with that in paragraph 15 of your statement. If you would just deal with that, please, and allow me to ask you one or two questions about those issues you raise in that paragraph.
So I can best illustrate that, Chairperson, in relation to 15.1, which makes reference to executive appointments and dismissals, which is within the purview of 1.3 to 1.1. And I just tried to remember changes in executive positions over the last 6 or 7 years. So if one looks at the following departments and traces the number of changes that they went through, but also in parallel, what were those departments looking at, either in procurement terms or other financial transactions. The one will be the Department of Energy, 2 will be the Public Enterprises, 3 is the National Treasury, 4 is Transport, 5 is Mineral Resources, 6 possibly is Communications, particularly the digital migration process, and 7, COCTA, particularly in relation to a small agency it has called MISA, which is set up some years ago for the purposes of infrastructure development in municipalities. So it has a budget of about 350 million rands.
What is it called?
MISA, Municipal Infrastructure something, SA, sorry, I forget the other 2 letters.
And of course, Minister, executive appointments and dismissals may also be relevant and certainly will be dealt with in evidence in due course at the level of state-owned enterprises as well.
Yes.
May I ask you, one of the legal team has asked me to raise with you the relationship between what you say in paragraph 15.1 about appointments and dismissals at any level of government, including the executive, and the ANC policy of deployment. Do you have any comment about that?
Yes, much has been made of the word deployment, but I thought it might be useful for the Commission Chairperson to look at the United States as an interesting example, not because of the current incumbent, but the practice that they have there. When a presidential election takes place in November and the new president is inducted in January, 6,000 people walk out of the halls and corridors of government. 6,000 people are supposed to walk in the next day, inverted commas. And of course, between November and January, a transition team is created. There's a new book by Michael Lewis, who actually wrote about the financial crisis in the post-2009 period, about this particular transition after the current president was elected as president. So essentially the party that wins and the president who wins has a choice to deploy 6,000 people, in essence. And the transition team is supposed to prepare that. But this book is about how it worked and didn't work, I believe. I haven't read it. The second is that deployment is a practice that you would see in most political organizations. That because political organizations and parties are there, as you pointed out earlier, Chair, to win elections. Once they win elections, they need to have people in place for the right reason or the wrong reason in order to prosecute whatever are their programs for which the electorate has actually supported them. And so after the municipal elections of 2016, for example, if the Commission just undertakes a short study, you'll find some very interesting examples of deployment as well. Thirdly, to come to my own organization, the ANC, it follows the same pattern, that it will look at certain areas of government, and the first line of deployment is cabinet. So immediately after, as you know, the president is inaugurated, virtually within 24 hours, the president announces his choices in terms of who occupies which ministerial or deputy ministerial position. So that's the first level of deployment. The second would be in various institutions. And here again, there is a practice that you consult with the head of state if there are vital issues in relation to a board or a critical position, which doesn't mean taking instructions, but it does mean consulting to ensure that one is doing the right thing or moving in the right direction, or one is aware of all the facts surrounding either a position or an individual. And in that particular regard, for example, in appointing boards of SOEs, we go through a process, either advertising en masse to say anybody interested in XYZ, please apply, which is what we did when we came into office, or advertise in relation to a particular institution. So if you are interested in forestry, the SAFCOL, you can indicate your interest there, and then you make some choices after checking the candidates that are available. And invariably, many of the choices that come out of that process are accepted, but there might be suggestions about entertaining other ideas as well, or other people. I'm not sure if that adequately addresses.
You deal later in your evidence, Minister, with appointments at the level of SOEs, and perhaps we can revisit the topic at that stage. You referred to the work by the group of academics entitled Betrayal of the Promise. The extract you requested to be placed in the supplementary bundle is at page 82. In paragraph 16.1 and following, you refer to various categories of actors. Perhaps for the less informed, such as myself, you could give examples of the persons or the officers that you're referring to in paragraph 16.1 and following, to allow us to understand your contention a little more clearly.
I'm sorry, Mr. Pretorius. Did you refer us to the supplementary bundle or not yet?
Yes, supplementary bundle, page 82.
82.
So, thank you.
May I ask, are you able to hear? Put it this way, am I speaking loudly enough? Let me put it differently.
No, I think I did hear the question then, but having to look for this page has made me forget, so you might wish to repeat that question.
Yes, it deals
the
with
page
the
now,
persons referred to in paragraph 16.1 and 16.5 in
the statement.
in the statement that you made in relation to the analysis by the group of academics that you referred to.
So the summary I offer is based on page, your reference 82, but page 56 of the Betrayal of the Promise report, and 2 or 3 pages after that, where there are 2 illustrations, Chairperson, that they offer. It's not me that has done this. So on page 85, there's a schema or a schematic diagram which reflects what I'm going to say, and the more generic form of that appears on page 82 of the annexure. So what the Betrayal of the Promise report suggests is that there's a hierarchy of operatives who are involved in a state capture project. The first is the people they call the controllers. These are very senior political people often, from the research that they've done, who are strong men who secure access to and maintain control over resources, and they are the patrons, if you like, of resources. And on page 85 of the annexure, they put in the names of Mr. Zuma at the head of that. But the Guptas could also be referenced as playing such a role because of the access they appeared to have to influence. The second category in the hierarchy is described as the elites. And these are people who are in the networks that can attract resources with the controllers and who establish and maintain patronage networks that facilitate the distribution of benefits. And these could be ministers in our terms, as well as senior managers, for example, in state-owned enterprises, who could play that role. And on page 85 of your annexure, you'll see some names that they've attached there. The next category is brokers, and these are people who have access to resources that can facilitate the trade of resources. And these are people usually on the outside. The names that appear in some of the documents, not necessarily this one, is the kind of role an Iqbal Sharma would have played as head of, I think it was called Assets and something, a structure within the Transnet board. The kind of role Salim Issa would have played in the Danel Asia case, in the 1064 locomotive case in relation to Transnet, and I'm sure there are many others. So these are the people who, as the word correctly suggests, broker the deals and have a sense of how the mechanics of that would actually work. The fourth and fifth categories in this hierarchy will be what are called mobility controllers and dealers. And these are people who have the ability to control the movement and access to resources, working closely with the brokers. And the dealers are the people who are responsible for managing and hiding financial transactions and laundering money. And the financial institutions often play a key role because of the kind of infrastructure they have, both within a country and between countries, so at a global level as well. And as you know, in today's terms, depending on how exchange controls are managed by the South African Reserve Bank on behalf of the National Treasury, with a click of a button, billions of rands in one form or another can find their way out. So at a click of a button, 1,000 transactions can take place of 100 million rands each, for example. And you can have that kind of massive transfer. The latter becomes quite important, Chair, when we start looking at the question, how much was stolen or appropriated by these people and projects? And secondly, where did the money go to? And thirdly, how do we track that money down? And fourthly, how do we reclaim that money through the various agencies? And again, if we don't have law enforcement agencies working well, then whatever bilateral agreements you have between justice departments or enforcement agencies, those won't be put into action because of obvious reasons, and you won't be able to serve South Africa by getting all of those hundreds of billions of rands back.
Yes. Thank you.
So that's the analytical framework.
Yes. From the point of view of the Commission, obviously, Minister, you introduce the Betrayal of the Promise report as a conceptual framework or an analytical framework, according to which you suggest the Commission might analyze the evidence before it. Of course, much of the evidence still is not before the Commission, and before we get to the stage of making conclusions, that evidence will have to be presented and analyzed. So by asking the questions in the manner we do not intend to forestall or foreshadow any factual findings that we have to make as a result of our investigations. May I just ask you briefly to go back, Minister, to paragraph 15. You mentioned there are 4 features of the state capture project, as you described it, which would distinguish state capture from individual acts of corruption. Would you just mention, please, for the sake of the Commission, the items in 15.1 to 15.4, which would constitute that distinction?
Well, 15.1 makes reference, as I've indicated, to Chairperson, the executive appointments and dismissals. 15.2 to persecution and campaigns of harassment and intimidation. 15.3, major public procurement projects. And 15.4, commandeering and neutralizing key state law enforcement agencies. I'm sure many others can be added, but I've just highlighted those four.
Yes. May we then go to paragraph 18 of your statement and ask you to comment on paragraphs 18 and 19 before we get to the role of National Treasury at paragraph 20.
Chairperson, in the context of having connected the dots, so to speak, and the various reports being in the public domain, the South African Council of Churches, as an important component of civil society, initiated a process of unburdening. Basically, anybody involved in malfeasance, would you like to come to us as religious figures and unburden yourself? Tell us what happened. How did you do it, etc., etc. And the outcome of that was the release of a report in May 2017, which documents the accounts of corruption and state capture from members and whistleblowers in their different congregations. And I wish to read into the record the following extract from the report, if I may.
You may.
And I quote, "It now seems that the problem is far greater than corruption, but organized chaos. We have now come to learn that what appears to be chaos and instability in government may well be a systemic design of the madness that ills our governmental environment, a chaotic design. A careful analysis makes the case for the following observable trends of inappropriate control of state systems through a power elite that is pivoted around the President of the Republic, that is systematically siphoning the assets of the state. They do this by, 1, securing control over state wealth through the capture of state-owned companies, by chronically weakening their governance and operational structures. 2, securing control over the public service by weeding our skilled professionals. 3, securing access to rent-seeking opportunities by shaking down regulations to their advantage and to the disadvantage of South Africans. 4, securing control over the country's fiscal sovereignty. 5, securing control over strategic procurement opportunities by intentionally weakening key technical institutions and formal executive processes. 6, securing a loyal intelligence and security apparatus. 7, securing parallel governance and decision-making structures that undermine the executive." Close quotation. So that sums up pretty much what I've been saying and what the Betrayal of the Promise report says. But this is an excellent example of our democratic balances, if you like, in our society, Chairperson, where the religious community also saw it as their responsibility to both analyze and bring to the awareness of the South African public what was going on, and how do you paint a picture of what was going on so that we all understand this phenomenon called state capture.
Then we get, Minister, to your evidence in paragraph 20, where you deal with National Treasury. There has been much evidence about the role of National Treasury in the issues or matters that we will cover in our terms of reference and have covered in our terms of reference. And from a public interest point of view, I would ask you to explain to the Commission and to the public what you know through your experience of the role of National Treasury and in particular the role of the Minister of Finance. In that regard, we have referred you to a document prepared by a former Minister of Finance, Trevor Manuel, and that document appears at page 86 of the supplementary bundle. And perhaps I can ask you to comment on the contents of that document. At paragraph 86, in the first paragraph, former Minister Manuel refers to the roles and responsibilities of the Minister of Finance. You could take a moment to look to that, or if you wish, read it onto the record.
Let me read that for the benefit of both the people here and people sitting at home and elsewhere watching. If I may, Chair,
Yes, you may.
the first paragraph says, the roles and responsibilities of the Ministry of Finance are distinctly different from all others. Firstly, the functions are performed through a number of discrete departments and a series of agencies. Secondly, there is the reality that even the tasks of the National Treasury alone are sufficiently diverse for the department to be considered an amalgam of different but interrelated functions. Unfortunately, the official handover report follows a set template for departments that does not adequately capture the complexity of tasks.
We can go on then, Minister, to the next page, page 87, where the work of the Ministry of Finance is described in more detail under the head, the job description of the Minister of Finance.
Again, I quote, Chair, even in the best of economic times, and these are not the best of times, is referring to that period when the financial crisis had just hit South Africa. Being the Minister of Finance means playing a role in government that will not always lead to unqualified popularity. This is, excuse me. This is partly a result of the role of the Minister of Finance in the budget process and all the expenditure management tasks that go with that. In this role, the Minister of Finance must advise Cabinet about what is affordable and, just as controversially, must recommend which of the contending priorities needs immediate resourcing and which might have to wait. Inevitably, this means that the Minister of Finance is sometimes cast in the role of an obstructionist or Scrooge and becomes the obvious target for blame if and when delivery agencies appear to fall short of their aims and objectives. The next paragraph says, another reason for the unpopularity has to do with the fact that the policy role of the ministry abuts those of a number of other ministries. This means that there may sometimes be contestation between the Minister of Finance and other members of Cabinet about the appropriateness of particular policies which fall outside the formal domain of the Minister of Finance.
May we then ask you to go to the next page, Minister? Under the head, the core responsibilities of the Minister of Finance now.
Again, I quote, Chairperson, the most significant entities for which the Minister of Finance is politically responsible are the two national departments for which the Minister is the executive authority, the National Treasury and the South African Revenue Services, and three regulatory entities, the Financial Services Board, the Financial Intelligence Center, and most recently established the Cooperative Banks Development Agency. He or she is responsible for two state-owned entities, the Development Bank of Southern Africa and the Land Bank. The Minister is also responsible for Statistics South Africa. Some of this has since changed.
If we could just pause there a moment. I believe there's a request for the supplementary bundle so that the legal representatives of interested parties can follow it. Perhaps I'll make sure they're distributed and then come back to this.
Okay, no, that's fine. And I guess the area, the areas or passages that have been read by the witness can be marked for purposes of helping the legal teams to see which paragraphs were quoted.
So I only have one more extract to deal with, and that appears
Yes.
at page 91 and deals with the functions of National Treasury, but we can do that in due course.
Thank you.
If I may just comment on one phrase that I made reference to, and that is fiscal sovereignty, Chairperson. It's a term that I think Minister Manuel coined at the time, but an important one for South Africans to understand. That after we dealt with the effects of the burden that the apartheid state left for the first democratically elected president and his administration, Mr. Mandela, and overcame the issues of debt and so on, South Africa can proudly say that most of its expenditure came from taxes that itself collected from its own citizens. Secondly, that South Africa has not subjected itself to acquiring loans or assistance in the form of finances from bodies like the International Monetary Fund. Therefore, South Africa is very different from a majority of developing countries where the IMF, for example, particularly in its old mode, is not able to come to South Africa and give instructions to its government on what to spend its money on and how to spend its money on the different projects that it actually intends to. And when we look into further the effects of state capture and the kind of destruction or undermining of key institutions, is that the ultimate effect could well be that we begin to impact on economic growth, we begin to impact, therefore, on revenue, both for the reason that economic growth is lower, but also the revenue collection agency is not in the state that it should be in. And ultimately, that impacts upon the expenditure framework that you can afford at any particular point in time. And you go through then a period of constraining expenditure rather than being not necessarily expansive, but certainly supportive of both economic growth and social transformation as well. So protecting fiscal sovereignty in our case is as important as protecting our democracy in terms of the Constitution.
Minister, would you then please go to paragraph 20? Not going to ask you to comment on another former minister's views, but just to place your own views on record in relation to the role of National Treasury and what you have brought before the Commission in the paragraphs which follow on page 11 and 12 of your statement.
The paragraph 20 then takes us back to the role of the Treasury. And it's to repeat the point that Minister Nene, I think, has already presented to you, which is that the finance minister is in effect analogous to the CFO of a big corporate. Of course, there's no big corporate as big as the South African state. And the relationship between the CFO and the CEO, in this case the president, has to be a harmonious one in order for the two key players within an enterprise to do that which is necessary in the interest of the enterprise itself and of society more generally. National Treasury is one of the key institutions, as I read through the extract, and it has many, many roles, actually. In the first instance, it has the role of formulating macroeconomic policy. So monetary policy is executed by the Reserve Bank at its own discretion and in its own independent right. But the inflation target, for example, is set and was set many years ago by government and, via the advice of National Treasury. The second component of macroeconomic policy is fiscal policy. In other words, how will we spend our money? Where will we get our revenue from? How much will we borrow? How much of interest on debt can we afford? How close to 60%, which is a nominal sort of ceiling that ratings agencies in the world would place on borrowings, that is your debt to GDP ratio. So how far would you allow that to creep towards 60%? A responsibility that the Minister of Finance, Mr. Mboweni, has today. And so that is a function that constantly monitors what happens in the economy, which are the growth drivers in the economy, which sectors of the economy, for example, manufacturing or agriculture or mining, as the case might be at different stages, is either on the plus side or on the minus side, and how do they each contribute to what we nominally call GDP, the gross domestic product. And that advice then takes the form of a macroeconomic framework, which is the basis upon which Cabinet ultimately decides the budget process and the budget content in numbers terms each year, both prior to the October MTBPS and finally before the budget in February each year. The second is the budgeting process. And there's a budget office within the Treasury, and that budget office, in a sense, brings together and coordinates a number of sub-functions. So the first is the macroeconomic analysis. So what would growth look like? And what are the growth projections for the next 3 years? Because we work on a 3-year cycle called the medium-term expenditure framework. The second is what is the anticipated revenue? It used to be a fairly ad hoc process in the past. More recently, there's a formal structure which involves the Reserve Bank, Stats South Africa, Treasury, and SARS, which emerges with some level of consensus on the estimates of the revenue that is expected. The third is to anticipate and not just anticipate, but now in the more recent years, set an expenditure ceiling. We can only afford to spend this percentage. And you'll find that in the numbers in the budget review, that's about 30% of GDP that we talk of total expenditure. No, sorry, of GDP. So that sets the expenditure parcel within which what I described in Minister Manuel's text is the allocation process that actually occurs. Then, of course, the allocations themselves in terms of their expenditure framework. In other words, which department receives how much of money. So what does the court receive versus Defense Department or basic education. And those priorities emerge usually from the manifesto of the governing party, translated into a medium-term strategic framework, and yet again translated together with the aspirations that we set in the National Development Plan into priorities that government would support at any particular stage. So that's the expenditure framework. There's an important task that the Treasury performs in terms of what it calls assets and liabilities. It's a complex function which most big corporates would have, and in many of the bigger state-owned enterprises, this is where institutions like Trillion and regiments entered the terrain and, inverted commas, earned fees for functions that the people employed there should actually perform. And essentially that function is, at the most basic level, each day of the week and each week of a month, there must be X amount of cash available. So that's where it starts. The next is how much of that cash will come from revenue collected, which ultimately goes into an account held in the South African Reserve Bank, and that account is, inverted commas, swept every night so that or the banks are swept so that we know how much is available. Then this section then decides on what are called short-term borrowing instruments for a week, for a month, or sometimes a few months, called Treasury bills. And so if you're running short of 3 billion rands this year, they'll issue a Treasury bill, just get that 3 billion rands in so that the expenditure side can actually work and the money flows where it is supposed to actually flow. But much more important, which comes up later in the statement, is the longer term borrowing for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. It's a complex function, and that is when we have these investment roadshows after the budget and after the MTBPS, because it's largely foreign investors and local investors that buy the bonds of government. And they basically say to government, we will buy your 10-year bond at a particular rate, but you can get one of the technical experts, Chair, to come and explain to you how all of that works. But the process involved here is to inspire sufficient confidence in those it requires to function at its optimum. And every economy in the world can't remain static. It needs to constantly change in order to both overcome weaknesses in the economy, but also seize opportunities that might avail themselves at a particular point in time. So we have internal roadshows within South Africa, because asset managers in South Africa would also invest in our bonds. So I spoke to a group of investors last Friday, telling them about SOE transformation processes and what are we doing to stabilize them, because many of them would have invested in Eskom bond or a Transnet bond or whatever the case is. But externally, much of our money comes from Europe. Frankfurt is a center for that. London, suppose they're not going to be much a part of Europe for longer after Brexit, but London is an important asset base. And then Boston, New York, and sometimes both San Francisco and Los Angeles is where the big money lies, and and these are the people you need to convince to buy the bonds. I think the number at the moment is that we have as our total debt parcel just over 2 trillion rands, which would have maturity levels, meaning payment dates, stretching from now into the next 20 or 30 years over this particular period. So that's an important the assets and liability function. I can go on talking about that. In addition to that, you have a public finance function, and that's the function related to the expenditure side. And here you have a number of officials who, in essence, are allocated to a particular set of departments who follow the expenditure patterns, understand their programs, understand some of the policy changes that they want to make or have made already, and are able to interrogate the department's numbers and whether they have actually spent the money in the right way, or whether the promised outcomes have actually been achieved, or the rate of expenditure is being kept with in terms of the promises that they've actually made. And it's the final outcome of those discourses that happen between Treasury officials, and there are others who come from other departments as well, because this is a technical process which is called MTech that the officials go through. It involves the presidency, I think the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation, and a few others as well. And they collectively decide what is to be allocated, or what is to be cut, or what is to be cut in one place and diverted to another at the end of the day. There's also a set of regulatory functions. The Accountant General accounts to the Minister as well, and the Accountant General sets accounting standards for the public sector. And there are then also institutions like IRBA. I just forget but it's responsible for, it's called the Independent Regulatory Board for the audit profession, which accounts to the Treasury as well. There are Also, IT systems that the Treasury runs either with other departments or in its own right. I don't know what they call these days, but there used to be a system on the expenditure side, which then tracks the expenditure of different departments. And then there was a system on the personnel side called Persel. So once one becomes an employee of a particular department, one's details are put onto Persel, and the Persel is the system that pays out your salary at the end of each month as well. So those would be your main functions. There are regulatory functions, as we've indicated, in respect of the financial sector. Or the Banks Act is assigned to the Treasury as well, and the Minister of Finance. And this is the act that regulates our financial system. More recently, after the impact of the Great Recession of 2007-9-10, globally, there was a major shift in the way in which regulation would occur of financial institutions, and that resulted in a policy document called the Twin Peaks Regulatory Framework, which today assigns new and bigger functions to the South African Reserve Bank, as I understand it, for what are called prudential regulation of insurance companies and banks and so on. And market conduct regulation is assigned to a new body, which is a successor to what I referred to earlier on as the Financial Services Board. So that's another key function. There's an additional piece of legislation in relation to exchange control. The legislation is the responsibility of the Treasury, but the function is executed on behalf of the Treasury by the South African Reserve Bank. And so they are able to actually monitor the flow of funds into and out of the country, which does worry some people in an interesting way, because there is the ability to actually follow the money, so to speak, as well. Maybe the last thing I want to mention, Chair, is the procurement function. After the kind of lessons that we've learned about the malfeasance in the procurement area, the procurement legislation has been crafted in the Treasury. There's another version of it I think they're working on currently or about to complete. And so in terms of the current requirements, two things that you might want to note. I must update my information on this. The first is, some years ago, we introduced, let's call it national procurement across different entities, meaning that instead of each department or each entity or each province buying ECG machines, for example, but in this case, the first, I think, experiment was with antiretroviral drugs. So in the past, it was a very fragmented procurement process, which means that you didn't get economies of scale and the benefits of buying large quantities. When Mr. Brown and others actually put the system into place, I think there was a benefit of 2 to 3 billion rands per year in lower costs in terms of procuring those drugs. There are a whole lot of other items that have entered that category of procurement. The second is that where there is major procurement items like the PRASA locomotives or the Transnet locomotives or the coal procurement in Eskom after the Tegeta saga and so on, is a particular set of approvals, if you like, that are required. What I forgot to mention is an important component in the Treasury called intergovernmental fiscal relations. So Treasury also monitors what is currently an allocation of about 44% of non-interest expenditure. So if you're spending R1 trillion collectively outside of paying interest, then 44% of that means 440 billion rands, goes to the provinces, and about 9% goes to local government. And Treasury has various mechanisms in place to monitor what each province does with its particular allocation. In terms of the Constitution, they get a bulk allocation, and the province then decides what does health get, what does basic education get, etc. So there's a function within Treasury that monitors provinces and a certain category of municipalities. I think the top 20 of them, and the rest are assigned to provinces themselves to actually monitor. So that gives you some idea of the span of its work.
Thank you very much.
That perhaps is a
Thank you.
background which will excuse us from returning to former Minister Manuel's document. And if we could go then to paragraph 21 of your statement, where you talk about the pressure or conflict in which Treasury found itself, which is a theme which will carry through in the factual portion of your evidence later on. If you want to assist the Commission then with the allegations on page 11 and 12 of your statement.
So in relation to paragraph 21, by way of example, Chair, is I think what Mr. Jonas was told by the Guptas, that if he accepted the finance position, one of his priorities would be to get rid of 4 officials, and they were named as the Director General Fuzile, Mr. Momoniat, Mr. Donaldson, and Mr. Brown, amongst others. Now, in an institution like Treasury, but indeed SARS as well, and I'm sure many others, institutional wisdom and knowledge is quite crucial. If you lose 20 years of experience, and Mr. Fuzile, for example, was in the Treasury for 20 years before he left for his current position, and that 20 years can't be taught in 2 years. So that's a classic example. The more recent attacks that Mr. Momoniat and others have been facing in Parliament and elsewhere is yet another illustration. The electronic media or digital media has been another mechanism through the various bots and how they work to also put the Treasury under pressure. And then from time to time, there would be this narrative which needs to be read in the context of what Mr. Manuel was saying. In fact, a former finance minister of Chile said to me on one occasion, the most frequent word a finance minister uses is no. And so, as Mr. Manuel says, that's what you become unpopular for, using the word no too frequently. And so as an institution, there have been occasions when the allocations expected in one direction went in another direction, and there would be criticisms about not enough money being made available. But if you look at the context, in other words, here's where the economy is, this is what the revenue picture is, these are the constraints and boundaries within which we need to work in terms of debt levels, interest payments, and so on, and credibility, then this is all that we can afford. And now we'll have to learn how to share it in the first instance, but also we'll have to determine what our priorities are as well. Now, we can't all be priority, and we do have some difficulty in setting priorities sometimes, as I'm sure all of us do as individuals.
Yes.
So you have those sorts of narratives which says National Treasury is too big for its boots, or whatever the case might be, because of the kind of function, an invidious function that it needs to actually perform.
Minister, you've referred then in your evidence to the institutional or interest-based routes of tensions between Treasury and other departments, given their different functions and roles. Whether there's more to it than that in relation to the conflict that Treasury found itself in past years will emerge perhaps from your later evidence. We needn't deal with it now in general terms. But I want to ask you in relation to paragraph 23, you say in your 6.5 years as Minister of Finance, we understand that to be during the period 2009 to 2014, and then from 2015 to 2017. May I ask, when in that period did you become aware of the distinction between state capture on the one hand and corruption on the other hand? In other words, when did the picture of state capture, as you've testified to, emerge for you, or on what event did it emerge for you?
Well, corruption, as you can see from the quotation that I gave from the budget statements, Chair, is a phenomenon, and I think you might well be right that there were prior references to this phenomenon earlier than 2009 as well. So the individual acts of corruption were known. I mean, the most popular reference point, if you like, we had was these bottles of water. So if you walk into a retailer, you pay 3 to 4 rands for a bottle of water. There will be any number of institutions that will be paying 30 to 40 rands for each bottle of water. And similar price escalations would occur on other items as well. Later, I can't remember, but probably closer to 2014, but maybe even prior to that, across to the current period, a new phenomenon began to arise, which the Department of Trade and Industry will call fronting. But this is a peculiar form, Chair, that we began to discover when we started looking at state-owned entities. And it seemed to spike quite phenomenally in many of them in 2015. It's a strange thing that there's a peak in these activities in 2015 in so many institutions all at the same time. And that is that where you have complex pieces of equipment and spares that need to be bought, for example, for an aircraft, a policy position was taken by a board, for example, which says that you shall not buy it directly from the original equipment manufacturer, what is referred to as the OEM. But if you bought it directly from there, for example, you could pay $40 million for it. You are now required to go through a company in the East Rand, which has no relationship or capacity to actually produce that part. But to that East Rand company, you will pay $60 million for the same piece of equipment, let's call it that. Had you bought it directly, you would have paid 40. So there's a 50% premium for doing nothing. Now we find this.
Sorry, may I interrupt?
Sure.
Perhaps my question was not put clearly enough. It's not the corruption or forms of corruption that is the subject matter of the question. Is rather when or on what event you came to understand, as you've stated in your evidence, that state capture was at play, as opposed to just different forms of corruption. Okay. My apologies for interrupting.
No, but this is just to even illustrate for people here and elsewhere the level at which it starts, and then how it manages. Because in order to instruct somebody to purchase in this particular way through an intermediary, for example, SAA Technical has a budget of 3.4 billion rands this year. You could probably save 50% of it if you buy those parts directly. That's what the CEO tells me. Now that's a waste of 1 billion rands, plus minus.
I know you are still going to...
I'm going to come back to the question.
To deal with it, but I just want to say, I've struggled to understand most of the time that kind of thing, because it seems to be quite very common in government departments, where sometimes things that, can just walk to a shop and buy and get them at a certain price, they want to go through, or they go through somebody else who then adds some percentage, and then they pay a lot of money, and it's taxpayers' money.
Yes.
It may well be that there may be, and you might know better, that there may be certain cases where it's things that are difficult to find, that maybe you might have to do that. But for many things, I don't see why it should happen, but it seems to be quite common.
Well, I hope, Chair, someday somebody interrogates that, but a popular example in that first period was laptops, for instance. If you walk into a retailer, laptop A would cost you 10,000 rands, but go through CETA and you pay 20,000 rands for it. So there are many such examples. So to come back to Mr. Pretorius's question, and somebody benefits. So the constant question, perhaps that would help the Commission, is who benefits from each of these events? Who benefits? Where does the money go? Who designs these processes? And for whose benefit at the end of the day? So those are a set of questions that would be perennial, if you like, across many of these instances.
But as far as you know, and you have been in government for many years, as far as you know, generally this would not have been an official government policy, or would it have been just individual officials deciding to do, or individual departments just deciding to do things in a certain way?
More individual institutions. So it wouldn't be government policy in terms of procurement policy.
In general, yeah.
But the way it's implemented, which nobody monitors, has the effect that we've just described.
Thank you.
So to come back to Mr. Pretorius's question, using these illustrations as an example, when did we notice what? When the first boards were being changed, after Ms. Hogan was dismissed from cabinet, for example, it looked like an ordinary set of events. One X number of people coming in, a Y number of people leaving. And then it still wasn't clear until more of these changes were being made, but the picture was still, I would think, fairly hazy. And then the kind of events that took place at the Treasury in late 2015, the manner in which the nuclear issue was dealt with, for example, all began to suggest that there was more to it than an individual act of what we today call corruption. That there's a wider set of intentions and scheme, if you like, that underpins it in some way. So I suppose late 2014, but mainly in 2015, these issues become clearer. But the final penny and the connecting of the dots began late 2016, after the kind of harassment that we were subjected to during 2016. I mean, the logical question must be why? I mean, if a principal doesn't want somebody he or she has appointed to a particular position, you dismiss the person or find grounds to dismiss the person. In this instance, you don't need grounds, as you know. You just don't have to like the person or like what they're doing, and that's the end of your career or your holding of that particular position. So when you begin to see a campaign being run, which we describe later, then one has to ask the question, why? And there's some interesting answers that one can actually give to that. So I think spanning that period, 2015 to early 2017, that picture and the haze becomes clearer. And the final penny drops, if you like, once the Gupta emails come into the public domain. Because that then provides us with the evidence that so-and-so suggested such and such to a person of authority, or even as early as, which we now discover, as early as the 4-day period during which Minister Nene's replacement was in office, documents that the DG then had prepared around the economic outlook and what our options were as a country. Now the emails show were distributed by, it would appear, the advisors to the then minister in office. So clearly the intentions were there during that time. And there was a particular interest momentarily during that. It was actually 2 working days, not 4 days. But in the 2 working days, there was a peculiar interest in SAA, for example, because that was the time, as we illustrate later, when the Airbus so-called deal was being undertaken, which also involved a fair amount of money if you went in one direction. Interestingly, it involves $40 million as well, compared to another direction that we finally took.
Thank you, Minister. The need is pressing to continue with your statement at paragraph 13, but may we do so with the leave of the DCJ after the long adjournment?
Okay, thank you. We'll take the lunch adjournment now, and we will resume at 2 o'clock. We adjourn.